Chapter 1. A Leftist Education. I sat at the back of the maths class watching Lai Mei, aged 11, stride up to the front and demonstrate a piece of algebra. It was something that children in the UK and US might only get around to learning at the age of 16, if they ever did at all. The Department of Education officials with me were shocked. This was just another high school in a humdrum city, Wuhan, China, in 2014. It was a visible manifestation of how the West was falling behind. We were turning out children who struggled to read and write, while we spent vast sums of taxpayers' money on their education and made life harder for working families through such high taxes in the process. Despite Britain being the home of the Enlightenment, many British children were not being told the most basic scientific and historic facts. Our results in English and maths have been slipping for years, and England had some of the most expensive childcare in Europe. I was in my first ministerial role as a junior minister in the Department for Education in 2012. Then Prime Minister David Cameron had given me a dual mission: improve educational standards and make childcare easier for cheaper for parents. Before being asked to join the government, I had set out in a series of think tank pamphlets how, by removing regulations and upping our standards, we could transform the system. This only showed the danger of writing pamphlets. Real life is much messier. Even on an issue where the solutions seemed obvious, the resistance was huge. At this stage, I was just delighted to get my first government job. Little did I know what I was up against. Progressive ideas were dominant in all areas of education, even at the heart of government. The previous Labour government had gone so far as to remove the very word education from the title of the department, instead rebranding it as the Department for Children, Schools and Families, complete with a childish rainbow logo. While we had restored the name upon taking office, the place still had rainbow decorations hanging from the ceiling. It was indicative of the culture we found. High taxes on families and a squeeze on wages meant it was hard for parents to afford to have children or to stay at home to look after them. The progressive left had both lobbied for more childcare at the same time, made it so extraordinarily expensive that parents couldn't afford it. For young children, the so-called experts favoured child-centered play over counting and learning the alphabet. This approach was more labour-intensive, with the result that it required higher numbers of staff, which hugely increased costs. Regulations on childcare ratios set out the number of children that each member of a nursery staff was allowed to look after. Staff could only look after a maximum of 4 2-year-old children at a time. Even in a normally more socialist countries like France and Spain, the regulations were much looser, with half or even a third as many staff being needed. In the 1980s and 1990s, things had been much looser. Britain had a boom of women entering the workplace, as well as a boom of family incomes. Our maternal employment outstripped Spain and Germany. But thanks to increased state regulation by the Blair government, the number of childminders had halved to replaced with government Sure Start centres, due to more state subsidiary and the imposition of countless new demands on childminders. The result was that parents lost their choice as to how to look after their children. Instead, we had a highly expensive, state-subsidized, prescriptive, bureaucratic model. I wanted the opposite. I wanted parents to decide and to keep more of their own money. I arrived at the department determined to change this, but from the very first hour I could see there would be resistance. My officials had done their homework and were holding copies of my childcare pamphlet. Though trained to be courteous and respectful to the ministers they were sent, the looks on their faces made clear that they did not like what they had read. The position of a minister is akin to that of a child emperor. Your every whim about how you would like your coffee served or your papers stacked is pandered to. But when it came to challenging, the way the system operates, or deeply embedded orthodoxies, there seemed to be endless ways requests could be evaded. I took this on in my usual style full frontal format. I was very clear to my officials what I wanted to achieve. I set a deadline for them to put together initial proposals and was persistent in keeping up the pressure for progress. This was a culture shock for some of the civil servants, who seemed to want to take their time and were not impressed when I began telephoning them directly to ask why the deadline had not been met. Apparently, this was not the correct protocol, and I should instead have restricted myself to asking staff in my private office to pass on a gentle reminder. I soon found friends of mine across government having quiet words with me, suggesting I might approach things differently. Articles appeared in the press describing me as a marionette. I received an award from the Spectator, with the walk-on tune at the ceremony being a song by Miss Dynamite. This was the department where I first earned the sobriquet Humane Hand Grenade, and all just asking officials to do things and adhere to deadlines. Having worked for Shell and Cable and Wireless at various rungs of the ladder, I was shocked by the slowness and bureaucracy of it all. It was a particularly frustrating introduction to the way government works. None of the officials had objected to the deadline or suggested it was impossible to meet. The paper simply didn't arrive. The senior officials clearly regarded me as a naive junior minister of little consequence and paid lip service to my demands while hoping I would eventually lose interest and move on to something else or be reshuffled out of the department. I also had to deal with the fact that back when we Conservatives were serving in a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, each government department had a Liberal Democrat minister working alongside the Conservatives, known to us as spies. And in education, this was David Laws, a close ally of the Liberal Democrat leader Nick Clegg. Although the Liberal Democrats claimed to be in favour of school standards, they were unable to resist the temptation of scoring political points with the progressive left. Getting around the Liberal Democrats, the officials in the department, and the rather wet Conservatives in Number 10 was a way of life for the ministerial team at the Department for Education. Michael Gove, the Secretary of State leading the department, was in his radical phase before he became a champion of net zero and anti-growth policies. He was constantly trying to pursue policies that Number 10 thought were too bold. His special advisor, Dominic Cummings, was his agent in the department, causing trouble and chaos. There was an element of the pirates having taken over the ship. Cummings gave me useful advice about how to avoid unnecessary Number 10 interference in my activities. If I did a press release announcing a new policy, then that would have to be cleared by Number 10. However, if it was a media script, that would avoid scrutiny. A lot of scripts were issued. When it came to my childcare proposals, the institutional interior from officials was compounded by the Liberal Democrat desire to play to the gallery. I drew up my plans, which proposed a modest loosening of regulations, allowing nursery staff to look after 6 2-year-olds instead of 4 and 4 1-year-olds instead of 3. They would also introduce more competition by permitting schools to expand the provision and reducing the number of regulations associated with setting up as a childminder. None of this would be compulsory, but it would allow parents greater choice and help reduce the costs they face. As far as the progressive left was concerned, I might as well have proposed arming toddlers with handguns. I was accused by Polly Tonby, a columnist at The Guardian, of wanting to establish cut-price baby farming, while the Preschool Learning Alliance launched a campaign saying the proposals were a real risk to children's physical well-being. Justine Roberts, the head of Mumsnet, the online forum for mothers, also came out against the proposals. This orchestrated opposition came predominantly from vested interests in the nursery industry, which were keen to preserve their existing business model with its high staff numbers and significant government subsidiary. They told the world that the high costs of childcare were inevitable and they should therefore receive even more government money, that is, taxpayers' money, to help pay staffing costs. They did not like being challenged as to whether they thought the high costs were in fact the result of their having to recruit twice as many staff as their equivalent nurseries in France, to look after the same number of children. To me, the basic arithmetic was obvious. I could not understand why some seemed unable to grasp the point. I also saw how this alliance was able to silence those who worked in childcare and agreed with me, gradually undermining support for my ideas. It was an early lesson in the ruthless power of progressive organizing and how the media prefers to report on personalities rather than truth and substance. Much of the reporting on me was highly personal, with even female columnists asking whether, as a mother, I myself would be able to cope with looking after multiple children. Seeing the way the wind was blowing, despite not having previously voiced concerns about my plans, and having formally signed off on them, Clegg now turned hostile to them. In June of 2013, he announced publicly that he would be blocking changes to the childcare staffing ratios. This was largely about pandering to various lobby groups and media commentators, but it was also widely seen as an act of political spite, attempted to defeat a prominent conservative policy in retaliation for the failures of some of his own flagship proposals. Clegg, I found, was one of those politicians who, despite fully understanding the logic and sense of a policy, nevertheless backs off as soon as there is any suggestion they might attract criticism from progressives. He would rather be popular than doing the right thing. He was now found a much more appropriate home in California and is working for Facebook. After my plans had been torpedoed, I was called in for a meeting with Prime Minister David Cameron. He wanted to reassure me, he said, it was a huge surprise that I had gone into the job and tried to deliver on what I'd said and I would do. Most ministers, he found, got sidetracked or gave up because it was too difficult. Indeed, I remain frustrated that we were defeated on childcare. 10 years after this battle was lost. British parents still face immense costs and government subsidies had gone up further. We would be more successful on school standards, another battle against the ingrained progressive education philosophy championed for decades by the left, ever since the revival of the US's progressive education movement in the 1960s and the publication in the UK of the Plowden Report around the same time. There has been a persistent and damaging idea in both countries that education should be child-centered. Though this sounds warm and fluffy, what it has meant in practice has been a belief that children should be left to somehow discover ideas for themselves, instead of being rigorously and effectively taught the body of knowledge they will need to survive in a tough and competitive world. This remains the heart of the debate over education. The reason children in Japan and China know their numbers by the age of 3 is that they have been taught them. They haven't been left to discover through play on the off chance they might stumble upon the basics of literacy and numeracy. A lot of nonsense has been talked about progressive educationalists, and the result has been that too many children end up not being able to read, write, and add properly. To my mind, there is nothing remotely progressive about leaving poor kids unable to get on in life and compete in the employment market, while those from privileged backgrounds have access to a decent education that teaches them what they need to know. It is a tragic irony that left-wing ideologies have been embedding privilege in our society for decades. The progressive movement in education arose out of trends of postmodernist philosophy, pioneered by the thinker Michael Foucault, which led to the notion that truth and morality are relative, and there is therefore no space for evidence and objective truth. Instead, we should all celebrate finding our own truth, whatever that is. Foucault also pioneered the crazy thinking about sex and gender ideology that now permeates the educational debate. The age-old resistance of young people to taking on the values handed down from older generations has become baked into an educational philosophy that says such generational transmission is somehow regressive and wrong. This sort of attitude has an instinctive appeal to a lot of people, who see it as being about overthrowing hierarchies and rejecting tradition in favour of free-thinking discovery. But taken to its full extent, as it has been in some quarters, it involves the undermining of historical and scientific facts, and leads to the situation where children are taught that the British Empire was wholly bad or that there really are 100 different genders. The prevalence of this worldview reveals a deeper unease about our culture and values. We can see it in the obsession with condemning our history and promoting collective guilt through campaigns to decolonize the curriculum. This is portrayed in the UK as a progressive movement to contextualize our imperial past, but it is in fact an ideological attack on that past that promotes a new narrative in which Western countries are always the villains. The scientific, industrial, and technological advances that made the West and now most of the world prosperous are turned into parables on the evils of capitalism and racism. This repudiation of the Enlightenment is astonishingly self-defecating. There is a distinctive air of self-loathing about it that is characteristic of the left. The most pernicious part of this ideology is the suggestion that in the modern world there is no need for children to be taught facts. After all, they can look up things on the internet. So we are far better off teaching them skills and encouraging their creativity. We need them to become free spirits with inquiring minds, not an army of drones reciting lists of dates and facts, right? You can see how this might be a superficially attractive argument, but it is utterly wrong. Of course, children should view the world with a critical eye, challenge accepted ideas, and be free to develop strong political views, but to do so, they need to be taught the basics, warts and all, without having the facts conditioned and censored by left-wing ideology. As Martin Robinson has argued, we need to rediscover the basis of a classical education, the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Under this curriculum, students are first taught the facts, grammar, before learning how to analyze them critically, logic, and then they acquire the skills to craft and present a convincing argument, rhetoric. This approach does far more to encourage their intellectual and creative development than bombarding them with pre-cooked ideological interpretations from the very beginning of the school days. My conviction that there is something profoundly wrong in our country's educational system was formed to a larger extent by my own experiences. I come from a middle-class family, with well-educated parents who surrounded me with books and ideas, so I did fine at school. But there were too many children who left my school without being able to read and write properly, while too much time was spent on supposedly progressive teaching practices and subjects. When I have spoken about this at various times during my career, it's often upset former teachers and classmates, who find it uncomfortable. I guess they will just have to accept that this is my truth. I went to primary school in Scotland, which was still a very traditional experience. Maths in the morning, comprehension in the afternoon, every single day. The belt was still in use, a rarity in the early 1980s. When I moved to Leeds at the age of 10, the teachers turned up their noses at my traditional Scottish education. I was told my new teachers were modern and did projects and had new subjects like environmental studies. Even at the age of 10, I reacted viscerally to being informed that the education I had received was somehow backward, and that my current one was better and more enlightened. That wasn't my impression, particularly when I found that environmental studies was an awkward fusion of history and geography, in which a lesson on Richard III and the mystery of the Princess in the Tower one day would be followed by something totally unrelated about the Consett Steelworks the next, devoid of any context. Then it was on Roundhay School, a state comprehensive in Leeds, where these progressive approaches were firmly embedded. I should be clear that there were some good teachers and good teaching there, and I had never sought to portray it as some dreadful sink school. It was a mid-table state school that was not particularly bad, but not particularly good either. What wound me up was the political correctness that pervaded everything it did, and the sense that lessons on unconscious racism seemed more of a priority than ensuring that everyone could read and write properly. Lots of children did perfectly fine at Roundhay, but it was too often despite the prevailing ethos that they're because of it. I had the benefit of my father being a maths professor who helped me with extra tuition at home, but others were not so lucky. There was a general lack of discipline, and among most students it was seen as acceptable to mess around and rather uncool to do any work. I lived in fear of being beaten up in the lunch queue or stabbed with a pair of scissors in my media studies class. Attempts to engage children ended up with us at the age of 13 being asked to stand on our desks to pretend we were on Sir Francis Drake's ship, Golden Hind. These experiences were certainly not unique to my schooling, but I found the lack of challenge and the acceptance of mediocrity very depressing. When we talk about the soft bigotry of low expectations, this is what I think of. Having seen how persuasive or pervasive the progressive orthodoxy had become, my experience when I became an education minister showed how far it speared or spread into the bloodstream of the whole educational system. The shared assumptions and outlook of those involved at all levels of education constitute what some have taken to calling the blob, a permanent immovable mass of resolutely left-wing prejudices and vested interests. My attempts to reform the nursery provision had given me my first direct experience of it, as I quickly discovered that the sector would close ranks against any attempt to alter their established way of operating and would mount a highly emotive and quite effective PR campaign to push back against change. In the aftermath of the nursery reforms being blocked, it was said that I should have approached it more gently, rolled the pitch better, and tried to bring people with me. But I believe there is very little that can be done to change the hearts and minds when the blob is so implacably opposed to being challenged. They are never going to agree, so it is pointless to try to persuade them. The choice for a genuinely reforming politician is either to have the fight and face them down, or to accept that you simply cannot make changes if they are opposed to them. The latter was not an attractive option for me. I chose to fight. My other significant battle was over reform to the maths curriculum. Here I faced constant pushback and attempts to dumb it down, with concerns expressed that what I wanted to do was to challenge for children to cope with, but I had seen evidence from East Asia that proper, rigorous teaching could achieve excellent results. My visit to China confirmed what I had read and cemented my impression that we need a similar level of focus on excellence if we were ever to match their world-leading performance in maths. It has become fashionable in progressive circles to stereotype East Asian teaching methods as crude and rote learning that crushes pupils' creativity and turns them into joyless automatons. But what I found in the classrooms we visited in China was quite different. Teachers explained mathematical concepts clearly and gave students swift and encouraging feedback. Children were excited to be there, answering questions enthusiastically and taking pride in explaining the solutions to the rest of the class. What made those Chinese classrooms stand out was the level of focus on the subject. Concepts and techniques were dissected and discussed in great detail. Then examples were worked through with increasing levels of difficulty. Children sat facing the front, allowing the teacher to spot anyone not paying attention or struggling. Those teachers are specialised earlier than in the UK. With separate maths teachers in primary school, as well as at secondary level, maths was taught every day from primary school onwards, while teachers provided swift feedback to individual students on their class exercises and homework to ensure none of them fell behind. After this, and other such visits, My view was that if children in China could manage it, why could British children not do the same? I used what I had seen to inform my proposals for reform of the maths curriculum. It might seem as a little odd that I should be so evangelical about Chinese teaching methods when so many of my wider arguments in this book focus on the threat posed by China to the West. But it is essential that we recognize the nature of that threat and understand how the challenge has been manifested. China's increased economic power comes in significant part from its advances in science and technology, and this is built on educational excellence. The story of how they came to do this is a revealing one. Many of the improvements arose out of Japanese teaching methods, with the Chinese system then prefected and rolled out on an industrial scale. What has characterized the Chinese approach to education, as with their attitude to do so much in the post-war period, has been a simple desire to win. I felt we needed to match that determination. I championed the adoption of the maths mastery model, which was associated with countries like Singapore and which the ARC chain of academy schools had successfully introduced. I made other changes to embed rigor in the system, such as banning the use of calculators in tests at the age of 11 to improve mental and written arithmetic, and ensuring that long division was a required skill. Even this provoked a massive row from critics, who said it was old-fashioned. Those who might have expected to be in favour were not always very helpful. The objective of the Royal Society Advisory Committee on Mathematics Education is to promote the take-up of the subject, yet they seem to think that their way to do this was just to make maths easier. I found that utterly self-defeating. Every day of the department was whack-a-mole in the battle for rigour and standards, combating the anti-textbook attitude, which meant that rather than having a tried and tested script, the progressiveness preferred teachers to invent every lesson, getting rid of coursework, which had led to widespread cheating, creating new tougher grades, and cracking down on grade inflation, and teaching proper grammar, which led to a widespread debate in the media about whether anyone really knew what a fronted adverbial was. There were hazards in being the minister responsible for all of this. It meant constantly being tested on my spelling and arithmetic live on television and radio. On one occasion, I remember an Eton-educated press officer desperately holding up a sign behind the interviewer's head on which he had scribbled the word rhythm to assist me during an impromptu spelling quiz. The scene would not have been out of the place on In the Thick of It. This showed the triviality of our media, which is more interested in gotcha moments than a serious discussion of the issues. But it was also highlighted a deeper problem with its implicit suggestion that knowledgeable of the basics was somehow an irrelevant obsession rather than a key component of a successful education. Our efforts to improve literacy centered on the use of synthetic phonics, which has been conclusively proven to be the most effective method of teaching children to read. Despite this, some in the educational establishment refused to accept the weight of evidence and continue to advocate a return to the progressive whole language approach that became fashionable in the 1960s. It is clearly less effective and has been shown to leave children unable to read properly, but because it stands in opposition to traditional teaching methods, it continues to have a vocal fan base on the left. The same goes for the use of setting in schools. The evidence shows that teaching children according to their ability in different subjects enables lessons to be pitched at the right level, with appropriate support given to those who are struggling, while the more able can be stretched to achieve their full potential. It makes perfect sense and it works, but again, progressive thinking considers it's inadequately and elitist, or elitist, so they would rather lump all children together. This attitude demonstrates the left-wing worldview, which would rather see us all fail together than accept any suggestion of inequality of outcome. Time and again, battles we fought had been won and to be refought. We worked hard to embed rigor in our educational system, and provide evidence that doing so improved results. But as soon as we turned our attention away to address other challenges, the progress we made risked being undone. It was like weeds in a garden. If you didn't constantly keep clearing them away, they would eventually take over and strangle all the other plants. All across the West, these progressive notions remain embedded in school systems. Not only does the dominance of left-wing ideology pose a problem for conservatives, but by eroding academic rigor and lowering educational standards, it has created serious problems for future competitiveness. International league tables show the extent of the challenge. China and Singapore sit at the top of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, PISA rankings of maths, science and reading scores, while the UK and US and most Western European countries languish mid-table. This has been the case for many years now. It should be no surprise that we are suffering the consequences of taking our foot off the accelerator when it comes to educational attainment. There is in some quarters a fatalistic acceptance of this relative decline, as though it were inevitable that we should lose our preeminence and be overtaken by others. But we are not passive actors. Conservatives should be pointing out that we have done this to ourselves by changing our behaviour and indulging damaging ideas that have proven regressive to our international standing. How has this happened? Why have we, the most technological advanced and prosperous countries on earth, given in to politically correct virtue signalling while allowing others to outpace us in educational standards? I believe it comes down to complacency. When a society becomes rich enough, there is a risk that it becomes decadent and stops trying so hard. The sense of entitlement built up by dominating the world stage for so long can lead to an implicit assumption that our children don't have to be as good or educated as children from East Asia in order to succeed. This, I believe, goes a long way towards explaining why some of the post-1960s progressive notions managed to take root, while other countries focused relentlessly on teaching in order to get the best results they could. We indulged the idea that we could diverge from those proven methods without suffering any adverse consequences. The West's decline in education can be reserved by only if we consciously address the root of the problem and get serious about fixing it. When we are resolute, we can win. When we have done it so, it has yielded results. In the case of maths teaching in England, the PISA study showed a dramatic increase in the scores of English students between 2015 and 2018. The first time any such improvement had been recorded since the study had first been conducted in 2000. The number of countries significantly outperforming English students fell from 19 to 12. This marked improvement was in contrast to the situation in Scotland, where the government, run by the Scottish National Party, has squandered the country's previous excellence in education and has seen its maths scores drop to the lowest level ever in 2022. England's jump in the league tables showed what a focused and rigorous approach to maths teaching can achieve. We have also made some progress in encouraging more students in the UK to study maths. There is a similar story of progressiveness in literacy. We saw significant improvements to England's reading scores during the 2010s thanks to the phonics approach championed by Nick Gibb, the UK's long-serving schools minister. He has been evangelical on the subject ever since before the Conservatives were ever in government, and has made it his mission to fight the battles needed to get phonics firmly embedded in our schools. We also managed to get grade inflation under control, though this ballooned again during the COVID-19 pandemic as a result of having to rely on teacher assessments instead of independent testing. So my message is not a pessimistic one. Experience has shown we can make progressiveness to improve results when we put our minds to it. It is undoubtedly difficult and involves fighting tough battles against persistent opposition, but it can be done. We have to view this as an existential challenge and go back to promoting the core values we know to be right: truth, science, rigor. This means being prepared to attack progressive ideas head on and say they are wrong. We have to fight as hard as the left and stop conceding growth to them. Too often, conservatives are either passive observers who fail to make their case or naive enablers who support progressive nonsense out of a misplaced belief that doing so is the only politically possible course of action. The latest examples of this are the ludicrous claims being made about gender in schools. We should be clear about the scientific facts about biological sex and not allow any under 18s to make irreversible decisions about their own bodies. That includes not allowing social transitioning, which is a pathway to this. Too many conservatives fear being seen as on the wrong side of history, but fail to recognize that the only way to be on the right side of history is by fighting for what they know to be right and winning the argument. The battle must continue to be waged against the educational blob, because doing anything else means the left will win by default. Here we should take note of O'Sullivan's law, which states, all organizations that are not explicitly right-wing will over time become left-wing. This is what has happened in education. It is not just the university, teaching, training departments, teachers, unions and professional bodies where we might accept such capture to have taken place. It is also the plethora of regulators, independent bodies, and even some academy schools chains that have failed to challenge progressive ideas and have thus become their enablers. The best bulwark against this is the power of parents. This has been a consistent theme of the Conservative Party's reform of education, which has tried to give parents greater control and choice over their children's education. The free school movement we have pursued in the UK is built on lessons from the charter schools in the US and is meant to turbocharge our own existing academies program. It's been a success in opening up choice and improving failing schools, but we cannot allow ourselves to get complacent. The left-wing state has taken too much power and responsibility away from parents. There is constant pressure for diktats on the meals that parents should be serving their children or what food and drink the children should be allowed to see advertised on television, not to mention the Labour Party's recent proposals for school-supervised toothbrushing. As we've seen in the field of healthcare in the US with Medicare and Medicaid, and in the reach of tax credits in the UK, the encouraging power of the welfare state seeks to bring ever more people into its controlling orbit. Welfare should not go so far as the income scale. Parents should be able to make their own decisions about how to look after their children. The same applies to looking after elderly parents. Parental rights and responsibilities should also be clear on trans issues. The bureaucracy that has grown up around the new mix of schools in Britain is already under threat of capture. Giving parents more power is the answer. Parents know that they want from their children's schools and can see when they are not getting it. We should let their clear and simple interest in demanding high standards for their children override the ideological indulgencies of the teaching and education establishment. Cutting the power of the central bureaucracy is necessary to do this. We should learn from the US school choice movement and institute a full voucher system in the UK. This would involve parents being able to use a voucher for the government, funding provided for their child's education at a school of their choice. Conservatives have been on the back foot in education for too many years, and the results of allowing the left to experiment on generations of children have been plain to see. Too many children in Britain and the US lack a knowledge of our history, our values, and even basic English and maths. China and other countries in East Asia have overtaken the West by focusing relentlessly on effective teaching, while we have indulged in ideological fads to remain competitive in the global knowledge economy. We in the West have to face up to the challenge and match the determination of our competitors to win. The only way we can do that is if conservatives step up to the fight to wrest back control of education from the failed left-wing ideas that have done so much damage.